I had arranged everything perfectly. That is the part that still rankles. 11 months after the fact. The convening floor of Station Kelvath 7 had taken me 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks of requisition forms, of diplomatic clearances, transport manifests stamped in 4 languages. I had sourced a Verith from the breeding pens on Sorathive, armored, bull-shouldered, 3 meters at the shoulder, capable of breaching a pressure door with its skull. I had requisitioned a bonded pair of Dureth from the Kelvari war kennels, scaled hunters, each the length of a military skiff, whose resting snarl had been known to empty corridors on sight, and I had paid, personally out of my own discretionary fund, transfer of a Skrell. A twin-tailed terror-hound, whose threat display alone had caused 2 previous diplomatic delegations to formally draw their petitions. The point was not cruelty. I want that understood. The point was demonstration. The Interspecies Joint Command Committee had been deliberating for 8 months on whether to grant humanity a seat at the operational tier, and in my professional judgment, 41 years of service, 3 campaign ribbons, commendation from the Arch Council itself. Humanity was not ready. They were soft-bodied, short-lived, emotionally erratic, constitutionally unsuited to the company of Apex-class combatants. The convening floor was simply the most efficient way to make that case, without filing another report that the committee would table for another cycle. I watched from the command tier as the human delegation filed through the lower gate. 14 of them, young, mostly, cadet rank, told me the senior staff had sent their training cohort rather than their officers. Either a diplomatic slight or a scheduling conflict. Either way, it suited my purposes. Cadets startle more visibly. I noted them in the order they entered. The tall one with the red collar pip who kept his chin up and his shoulders square, very aware of being watched. Pair behind him who moved in close formation, shoulders touching. A cluster of 4 who had clearly drilled together. And then, near the back, unremarkable enough that I almost didn't register her at all. A woman, early 20s, plain-faced, dark hair tied back, academy fatigues with no distinction pins. She was not squared up. She was not performing readiness. She walked the way a person walks through a transit hub, unhurried, hands loose, a mild and general interest in her surroundings. Eyes moved across the convening floor and aimed briefly on the Vareth, in its containment pen, and then moved on. The way eyes move on from something that has been noted and cataloged and filed. I remember thinking, that one will be the first to break. The Vareth was released first. Standard protocol. The containment gate retracted, and 4,000 kilograms of armored predator stepped out onto the floor and drew itself to its full height. The sound it made, a subsonic percussion in the chest cavity, not quite a growl, more like the building preparing to shift, silenced the human delegation in an instant. The tall cadet with the red pip went rigid. The cluster of 4 pulled together. 2 cadets near the left wall took an involuntary step back. The cadet with no distinction pins did not move. The Vareth turned toward the group. That is what it does. It reads the room by thermals and micro-vibration, and it moves toward the highest concentration of fear. It crossed the floor in 8 strides and stopped, and I leaned forward in my seat, because it had stopped short of the group, and its great armored head was tilted. It was reading her. She looked back at it, not staring it down. Nothing so theatrical. Just looking at it the way you look at something you find genuinely interesting, head very slightly to one side. The Vareth exhaled, a long, slow crescendo of breath, and lowered its head by perhaps 60 degrees, full submission posture. But enough that the 3 Kelvari senior staff flanking me went very quiet. She lifted one hand, palm up, and waited. The Vareth pressed its forehead against her palm. I released the Dureth. Both of them came through the gate at speed, is their natural state. Dureth do not walk, they flow, scales rippling, low to the ground, covering distance in the silent, efficient way of things that have never needed to announce themselves. The human cadet scrambled. Somebody shouted, "Tall!" One with a red pip slapped feet and put his hand on his training baton, which would have done nothing, and which I noted as bravery of the specific kind that precedes injury. The Dureth flowed past him entirely. They flanked her. One on each side, slightly behind her shoulder, a position I recognized because I had seen bonded Durath take it with their registered handlers during field deployment. It is a protection posture. The Dureth were telling the room she was theirs to guard. She reached down without looking and rested 2 fingers lightly on the nearest one's scaled neck ridge. It made a sound low in its throat, a sound I did not have a classification for, because Dureth, under standard conditions, do not make sounds that could charitably be called contented. I released the Skrell. This was, in retrospect, excessive. But I had spent considerable political capital on the Skrell's transfer, and I was not, at that moment, thinking with complete clarity. The Skrell is not a large animal. It is the size of a large terrestrial canid, twin-tailed, with a resting threat display that involves every tooth in its skull, and a vibrational frequency in the 20 Hz range that triggers a prey flight response in most species at a neurological level below conscious thought. 3 previous diplomatic delegations had withdrawn from rooms that contained a Skrell. I have seen decorated Kelvari officers leave their posts rather than share a corridor with one. It came through the gate, saw the room, broadcast its display at full amplitude. Every human in the delegation recoiled except one. The cadet with no distinction pins crouched down, not away from it, toward it. She went down on one knee, put her hand out flat on the floor and made a sound. A low, easy, tuneless sound. Not quite a whistle, not quite a word. I could not hear it clearly from the command tier. The Skrell's display ceased. It walked to her hand, sniffed once, and sat down on her boot. The convening floor was entirely silent. I was aware of my senior staff not looking at me, which is its own species of communication. It was at this moment that Cadet Heron Dusk made his decision. I had not noted him during the initial entry. He was mid-group, unremarkable, a cadet with the specific expression of someone who had spent his academy career being told he was exceptional. He had watched the entire sequence from the cluster of 4, and now he moved forward. And he was not moving forward to assist or observe. He was moving forward to be seen. Moving forward, he wanted to be the cadet who interacted with the beasts. He wanted to be the point of the story. He put his hand on Senevos's shoulder and stepped past her. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. The Vareth's head came up. The Dureth moved, both of them, simultaneously, not toward Dusk but around him, repositioning around her, a fluid bracketing motion that put 2 scaled apex hunters between her and anything that might reach her again. The Skrell stood from her boot and turned, and its display did not return. It made no threat display at all, which in the Skrell is a distinction without a difference, because the absence of display in an aggressed Skrell means only that it has moved past the warning phases. Heron Dusk froze. Senevos stood up. She looked at Dusk for a moment with an expression I can only describe as mildly tired. Then she turned to the Skrell and said quietly and clearly, "Easy." The Skrell sat back down, not on her boot this time, between her feet. She looked up at the command tier then, directly at me, though I don't know how she identified where I was. And she said, in a conversational volume that nonetheless reached every corner of the floor, "Are we done?" I did not answer immediately. Behind her, the Vareth had settled into a resting posture. Weight back, head lowered, the posture of an animal that is effortless for the afternoon. The Dureth flanked her in their guard position, motionless. The Skrell sat between her feet, with all 3 of its tails wrapped around her left boot. Heron Dusk was escorted from the convening floor by 2 of my staff. I did not instruct them to do this. They did it because the alternative was standing in the same space as 3 apex predators whose attention had not moved from him since he touched her, and my staff are not paid enough for that. I filed my report to the Joint Command Committee the following morning. I recommended humanity's inclusion at the operational tier. I framed it in terms of interspecies compatibility metrics and adaptive threat response files, which are both true and sufficient. I did not mention Senevos by name, part because her personnel file contained nothing that would explain any of what I had observed, and partly because I suspected she would find the recognition unnecessary. She was, as of last quarter, assigned to the Joint Operations roster as the primary handler liaison for the station's Apex-class asset pool. The Vareth transferred with her. So did the Dureth pair. The Skrell's paperwork listed the transfer destination as her bunk assignment, is not a location that appears on any official housing manifest, and which no one in my staff has chosen to flag. I have not spoken to her since the convening floor. I saw her once in the main transit corridor on level 4, with the Skrell walking at her heel and one of the Durath moving ahead of her through the crowd, parted for it, in the way crowds part for things that are very large, and very quiet, and very certain of where they are going. She had a cup of something from the commissary, and she was reading a report on her slate. And she looked, as she had always looked, entirely ordinary. I watched the corridor empty ahead of her, and I thought, 41 years of service, and I still arranged everything wrong.